up people, but they'll sort of trickle in as we go. So I would just first like to say a little bit about myself and the think tank. So my name is Margaret MacDonald, I'm president of King's Think Tank. What we do is that we try to provide the sorts of events where we can inform students about relevant topics, and then they can, go away, form their own opinion, say, okay, this is what I want to do about it, this is how I would change the situation. Then they come to a workshop with us, we give them the skills to put their ideas into policy, and then we provide a platform through which we can advocate that policy to either government, to international organisations, NGOs, you get the picture. So today we'd like to welcome Sir Bill Cash. Sir Bill is a Conservative politician and he's a Member of Parliament for Stone. He's also a prominent Eurosceptic in the House of Commons, I think most people here will know. He's the founder of the Maastricht Referendum Campaign in the early 1990s and is now the elected chair of the House of Commons European Scrutiny Committee, as well as serving as the vice president of the Eurosceptic pressure group Conservatives for Britain. He's been described by Kenneth Clarke as the most Eurosceptic Member of Parliament. So we'd like to welcome him for his speech.
Thank you very much indeed. Right. So where did it all begin? Actually, in 1945, I suppose, because at that time I could quite easily understand my own father having been killed in the war, got the military cross in Normandy, that it would be a good idea to try to make sure that we never did it again. But life isn't quite like that, because actually it's not history that repeats itself, it's human nature. And therefore, the idea that somehow or other, as Monet, Schumann and various others thought, that the answer would be to pool resources with the ECSC and to create a supranational organisation, try and take a lot of the politics out of Europe. Pretty ambitious. And foolhardy, actually. I voted yes in 1975, and I was actually a very enthusiastic pro-European. I mean, I founded Westminster for Europe, I was one of the founding members, and various other aspects of my political life, until I began to really comprehend what was going on. And that was in the 70s. So I came into Parliament, in fact my 32nd year in Parliament started this morning. So I'm now actually in my 33rd year, and I've been in the whole time. And funnily enough, I went on to the European Scrutiny Committee, it was then called the European Select Committee, Select Committee on Legislation, in 1985. And when I'd been selected, I can confidently tell you that there were 310 people competing with you. It was quite difficult to get in, actually, because it was very competitive. And I was talking to Anne Clwyd this morning, because she came in on the same day as me from a by-election. And I was a by-election as well, and so was Virginia Bottomley. But the word Europe didn't come up in the selection at all. There were 310 people who applied, and I was a lucky one. No one was much more surprised than me. And I've been there ever since. But actually Europe didn't come up. And that was when Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister, of course. She'd been Prime Minister for several years, so she came in 79. And it just wasn't an issue. But I started looking, because I'm a constitutional lawyer, I had a huge practice. In fact, I very nearly came to read law at King's College. I was down and I'd been accepted, and then I got an offer from Oxford, and I went off to Lincoln College, Oxford. I mean, that's life. I had a very nice time, and I read cricket and history in that order. And also 18th century history, which has a lot to do with my intellectual development, and I suppose I ought to call myself a sort of historian. I'm a jobbing historian. I wrote a history of John Bright, which was better reviewed than I'm sure it deserved. And I've written several books, and I've got a new book coming out very shortly, called From Brussels with Love. which is a hefty but very interesting tome. And some of the people who've read it have said it's quite extraordinarily fascinating because instead of dealing with all the things that are going on in the referendum, what I'm actually doing is looking at the reasons why and how, rather than just the incidental policy issues that we like and don't like. I mean, I spend so much of my life doing meetings like this, and yesterday afternoon, I spent nearly 2 hours, 1.5 hours, cross-examining the Prime Minister with others on the European issue. And I was told as I was leaving the office, my PA said, I've just done a check on Facebook, is that what it's called? I don't do any of that. I don't do email, I don't type, I don't have anything to do with it. And I find that liberated, because I don't get bogged down in that, and I can think, if that's something that's been given to me. And I discovered that I've had 68,000 hits on what I said to Cameron yesterday, which is quite a lot, I suppose. So basically, I feel very, very strongly about what happened. So I'm sitting there in the European Scrutiny Committee, or as it was, and I started going to Brussels. And one day, being a constitutional lawyer, and I did a huge number of really big cases. I mean, you know, I advised Quebec, I advised on the Falklands, I advised on Grenada, I advised on almost all the biggest stuff that was going on in the 70s. And I was in my 30s then, and I had a fantastic career ahead and behind. And the bottom line was that I didn't get bored with it, but I just suddenly began to think I'd rather like to get involved in something more direct, instead of advising people, actually doing it. So I talked to my wife, who was very, very, very sympathetic, and we gave up a monumental income and a property which I owned with my partners, and my share was worth 3 million, and I gave it back to them. And cut a long story short, I really felt that I ought to do what I believed in, rather than just advise people on what seemed to be the right answer to certain questions. So I go to Brussels with the European Committee, and it was the most tedious and boring stuff about some arcane agricultural regulation or something. And I said, I really can't take this any longer. What I'd really like to do, I said, is to go and meet the legal advisor to the European Commission. And so it was arranged. And about an hour later, I'm sitting in this chap's office, and I said, I'm a constitutional administrative lawyer, and you know, I'm really interested in how the structure of power works, and here we are in 1985, and you know, development of the European Union. It's before the Single European Act, of course, so we're still on the Treaty of Rome at that stage. And he began to get very, very interesting, and he started telling me a lot of things that maybe in retrospect it's been unwise for me to have been told at that stage, which was, well, we're going to make a federal Europe and things like that, you know, and this is the building blocks, and this is how it's going to work. And it was fascinating, very nice man, very honest and straightforward. So I immediately wrote to the Prime Minister and said, this is what's going on. I said, this I can tell you, because if you are the person running, if you're the legal advisor to the European Commission, it's rather like being parliamentary counsel. You know what the policy is, and it's your job to deliver it. And so I then began to wonder. Then we had the Milan summit, I think that was it, which was the prelude to the Single European Act. And now I'm going to make another statement about my pro-European credentials. Don't sound very anti-European, do I?
I'm sure we'll get there.
Well, you will. I will. I voted for the Single European Act. And I looked at it and I thought, well, on the balance of probability, if it works well, then we all benefit. And majority voting may be a way of helping that to happen. But, I thought to myself, just suppose it doesn't work. And then what would we do? So I put down an amendment And in a nutshell, it said that nothing in this Act shall affect the sovereignty of the United Kingdom Parliament. And that's when the balloon went up. And my name, you can look it up, and I dare say if you can Google that deep, you can drill down to find the amendment. And I did it the other day because I wanted to convince myself that I'd done it, because I knew I had. I couldn't find it, and I did. And actually, it's a bit longer than that one sentence, but that is what it says. And they wouldn't allow me to debate it. They said this was not an issue which can be debated on this bill because it's beyond the scope of the bill. I said, no, it's not. I said, this bill is a bill in its own right. It may be that it will be associated with other treaties which are going to be put in Section 1 of the European Communities Act, because it's an accumulative process, if you know what I mean. And yet, anyway, I wasn't allowed to. But in fact, I remonstrated and I had arguments with very, very eminent people, but it didn't get me anywhere. And I tried to get up on a point of order, and I was told to sit down, and various things like that. And so the bill went through, but without my amendment. It became the Act. Now, we then move on to the next phase, and I'm skipping along a bit because we're now in 1986, and that was a formative moment. And by the way, just out of interest, you may be interested to know that Margaret Thatcher has, of course, repudiated her support for that, and she did before she died, a long time before. And also, she used to ask me to go in and talk to her, which I did in number 10, reasonably often. And we would always end up by agreeing with one another about where it was going, because I was writing her papers based on my analysis as a constitutional lawyer and a sort of historian about where I thought all this was going. And we go forward to 1988, and I helped to formulate some of the ideas of the Bruges speech, because I wrote another memorandum then, which I set out my arguments about creeping federalism. And around this time, I was also invited by the Times to write a regular op-ed. Now, they wouldn't touch me with a barge pole at the moment, I don't think. They do put my letters in the Times, in fairness, but to actually have the main slot to do the op-ed every time there's a European summit was quite an extraordinary sort of thing. And I probably got 14 of these articles, usually with a cartoon to go with it, which is rather nice. Every time I would say, another turn of the ratchet, and this is what I think has been happening, and this is where I think it's going, and there was one I wrote, grinding their own axis, which was about Giscard d'Estaing and Mitterrand, and Helmut Schmidt, who had written a paper for the benefit of the European community, stating why the Franco-German axis was so, the Franco-German relationship was so important. And it appeared on Valentine's Day, so I said this was not a very happy Valentine's card to these people. So there we are. And I wrote all these various articles. In the meantime, we go 87, 88, Bruges speech. I then founded the Bruges, not the Bruges group, though I was instrumental in forming it, because Patrick Robertson, who then all founded it, I rang him up when he was at Keble College, Oxford. And I'm not suggesting it was my fault, but he actually left Oxford as an undergraduate to set up the Bruges group, which he did very successfully. And I set up a thing called the Friends of Bruges for the House of Commons. So I didn't actually formally join the Bruges group, but not that I would have any objection to doing so, but I always thought it was slightly better to do things on our own terms. I then got elected by a bit of organised electioneering to become the chairman of the Backbench Committee on European Affairs, which was crucial, because it was a secret ballot, and they knew how many votes I got, even though had it not been a secret ballot and been open, I'd have probably got 5 votes. actually I got a huge number. And that put me in a very, very interesting position, because Margaret Thatcher, yes, she was Prime Minister, but as we discovered, she was on the way out. And the fact that I've been elected by all these people shows quite an interesting contrast with the reasons why the top people who are with her want to get rid of her. So there I am. Then I become, then she is assassinated, as I can put it, politically assassinated. And then I stood again as chairman in the same week that John Major became elected as Prime Minister. Well, this was very interesting, because I get re-elected by a very significant majority in the secret ballot, but in the same week he gets elected as Prime Minister. So I have a sort of authority in a way from the backbenchers, which gives me the right to be able to speak out on their behalf. And at the time, nobody really thought that anything much untoward was going to happen, because he'd sold himself on the grounds he was fiercely Eurosceptic. I had my doubts. And so, to cut a long story short, we then get into the Maastricht period. And I led the rebellion against the Maastricht Treaty, and as you said, I set up the Maastricht Referendum Campaign, and we got hundreds of thousands of signatures, which was a lot in those days, considering the fact that it was rather a blank piece of paper to most people outside. But once they got to know about it, and this is really where I'm leading to, it's not just about the analysis as a lawyer or as a historian. It's about how all these different factors merge into a question of attitude, identity, and instinct, which is why talking to a very important person in the House of Commons today, viz. The Minister for Europe, I did say to him, you want to watch out for this, because actually there's something moving in the waters out there. And it's very, very interesting for us as members of Parliament, because we talk about it a lot amongst one another. And what is happening is actually not, as far as we can judge, and I'm very cautious on this, matched by the opinion polls. I mean, for example, when I cross-examined the Prime Minister yesterday, I said that on the package that he brought back, and you can ask me technical questions if you like, but basically, on the question of the package, being chairman, I forgot to mention, in the meantime, after the 2010 election, I'm then elected by the House of Commons, or in the House of Commons, as chairman of the European Select Committee. Well, that puts me in quite an interesting place. And I have a very supportive committee. It is all party, so it's not just Eurosceptics, but it's a very important committee, because we are responsible for all the scrutiny of European legislation. And of course, a lot of that is also policy. And I've done several reports, including trying to, as it were, disaggregate some of the analysis to the individual select committees, say, for example, for transport or defence or whatever, so that business, so that we don't just do the. It was traditional that we only did it, and I'm now trying to devolve some of it to get them involved, which is rather an important initiative. But in the meantime, after and during the Maastricht Treaty, I became completely convinced that this was all about European government. Now, any of you could say to me, but why didn't you know that already? Well, I did, because it's all written into the books and the analysis, and if you read anything about it, they'll talk about political union. But none of it could happen unless they agreed that it would happen. So basically, it was a form of acquiescence. And that raises another question about who is calling the shots. Because actually, you can say no, but you can also get into grave difficulties if you say no and you're not prepared to face people down. She did over the rebate, but when John Major took over, yes, there was an opt-out. Yes, there was an opt-out from the social chapter, but no, there was no real resistance to the notion of European government, and that's what did it. So I put down about 150 amendments, which is quite a lot, and I set up a campaign headquarters in Great College Street, funnily enough next to my own office, and I started up this campaign, and we really went for it. And I don't know whether any of you, did anybody here listen to the reunion about Friday last week? Reunion with Sue McGregor? Well, it was very interesting, and I will touch on it because the reunion is a rather special kind of program. It only goes out a few times a year, and she brings together people who've been involved in some form of historic event, say climbing Everest, or, it depends. There's no particular pattern to it, but for some reason, and I can understand in relation to the European issue, that they thought, oh, well, let's do this Maastricht Treaty, because it was a historic event. And why was there a rebellion? And who led it? And what was the attitude of the individuals? So there were 6 of us sitting around this table in the studio. And the others were, so there's me, and I'm the leader of the rebellion. And I went in there and I thought to myself, this is 4 or 5 to 1. I'm out of my comfort zone here. And there was Ken Clark, there was Norman Lamont, there was David Davis, who was the whip on the bill, and there was Stephen Wall, who was the chief advisor on European matters to the Prime Minister. And so we got talking. And I don't want to spoil the story for you, but by the end, it wasn't at all me on my own. It was really, I was in a majority actually, and the reason for that, and it wasn't an argument, it was about what had happened. And I just want to tell this to you because this is one of the most important enactments made in British history in the last few generations, which is now being reviewed. Because this referendum is not about Europe just today. It's about the foundations on which political union is based, and that is the Maastricht Treaty. So that for practical purposes, that discussion was very, very interesting. And the question is, should it ever have gone through? Well, obviously I thought it shouldn't, and I said so. But I bothered to get out the division lists, and I looked, there was one particular vote where which we only lost by 3 votes. And I looked up the division list, and I looked through the names and ticked off those who I knew, I didn't have to think, I knew were against the treaty, or subsequently decided that under no circumstances would they countenance these developments. There were over 30, which meant that the bill should actually, if they had actually been able at that time to bring themselves to vote against it, it should never have gone through. And we wouldn't be sitting here talking about it, basically, I don't think. So that was the Maastricht Treaty, and it was all about European government. Now, why did I object to European government? Now we get into the meat, which is basically, it goes back in a way to what I said about the Single European Act, my sovereignty clause. Because actually, I do believe in cooperation and in trade with Europe. 40% of our trade is with Europe, 44%, I think. But trading in and of itself doesn't actually mean that it is necessarily in your interests. And I just jump forward now to the latest figures from this month, or last month, April, mid-April, from the House of Commons Library, the Office of National Statistics, and another source, which I'll mention in a minute. And these are independent assessments. Now, how many in this room, if I can ask you, no, I'm not trying to be funny, but how many people have heard that the single market is an enormous success for the United Kingdom? Okay? Everyone. Anybody who doesn't?
Right, we've all heard it.
We've all heard it. The question is it? And I'm just going to give you one headline figure, and I can look at other things in a moment about the manner in which the legislation is passed and the extent to which we really wanted it and or acquiesced in it. And basically, it goes like this. If you take, any economists here? One. Okay. If you take, it's called current account transactions imports, exports, goods, services. It's called, really, I suppose, the sort of the basic parameter for analysis of international trade. And on that criterion, bearing in mind it's goods and services, last year, and this has been accumulating and growing exponentially, last year our deficit with the other 27 member states was £58 billion. It's jumped enormously in the last 6 months, and it is now 60, I think it's 60, I've got the figures here, but we take it 65, 68 billion. It's gone up enormously. And yet our surplus with the rest of the world, with the same goods and services, is running at 31.1 billion. And that's been growing exponentially. So that's with the 27. So you might say, well, you have to take a hit. If you want to trade, you might not get everything your own way. But this is a growing trend, and it's getting more and more severe. So I then asked the question, and I've got all the figures here, of all the countries in the whole of Europe and their trade with the other 27 in their case. So I've got the figures for Poland, I've got the figures for Germany, I've got the figures for Hungary and everything. And it's very, very instructive. In a nutshell, the German surplus with the same 27 is 85 billion. I've got the figures, I can't actually remember it precisely, but I think it's 85 billion, certainly not less than 83 billion. So their surplus with the same 27, so just think about this, and I repeat, it's over 60 billion deficit with the 27. So you aggregate everything, there's a lot of loss in there. The Germans, on the other hand, 80 plus billion. Now, is that a good deal for us? Well, I say I wish my sovereignty clause had gone through, because actually we wouldn't have to be arguing about this now. We have got this referendum. So, then there is the whole question of what that also reflects. Now, I've spoken in Germany quite a lot in the past. I had a very interesting meeting with Helmut Schmidt on my own for 2 hours in his office, discussing all these matters. Because I wrote a book in 1990, it is called, you can buy it for about 50p on eBay, I suspect, but it's called Against a Federal Europe. And it sets out the reasons why, because I felt I should, rebel against my government. But it wasn't written as a rebellious book, it was written as a book of analysis. The first chapter, funnily enough, or better off, was Britain for Europe. And it sets out all the things that we've done, and what we feel about it, and my feelings about it, and why I wanted it to work, but found it couldn't. And then there are other chapters on federalism and various other things. And there's one other chapter called A European Germany and a German Europe, which is taken in its way from Thomas Mann's statement, will it be a European Germany or a German Europe, which is 1953, and I said it's going to be both. Now that's 1990, and I have to tell you that quite a few people have said to me fairly recently, over the last few years, you got that one right, because actually this is what's been going on. It's not just the single market aspect of it, it's other things as well. If you, Mr. Varoufakis was sitting here next to me, he'd have a lot to say about what went on in the last 6 months or a year in relation to the German-Greek situation. And then the Portuguese might come along and say, we'd elected a government, but we were told that we couldn't have a government because it infringed the bailout clauses. And therefore, bingo, no government, really. And then there's this massive row going on at the moment with Mr. Renzi and the Germans and Mr. Wiedmann. And really, it's quite dramatic. All because, although Germany itself had an infringement, a serious infringement of the Stability and Growth Pact in 2004, nobody blinked an eyelid. But Italy, which is a very big country and a very important country, actually is having the most massive row with Germany because Germany will not allow the changes that are needed to enable some wiggle room for Renzi to be able to deal with some of his intrinsic economic problems. And I'm not saying that I believe that the Greeks and the Italians are no than the Spanish. And then you ask yourself, how many countries haven't got any real government at the moment? Well, I've got a list here, and you can challenge me on it, perhaps. I don't think you want to. But I mean, we've got Greece, which I don't think really could be described as having a very stable government. Spain, no. Ireland, no. Italy, difficult. It's had two bureaucratic governments in the last 4 years. What I'm really saying is this, that when people talk to you about the idea of political union and the idea that it's intrinsically a good idea, when I hear David Cameron going on about why, despite the fact that he was a Eurosceptic, I don't think he is now, you then want to call it a reformed European Union when you haven't got a package, as I think I proved yesterday. I think the 68,000 hits has got something to do with that. I won't go into the technical details, but it can't be an irreversible agreement, because although in international law it is a legally binding agreement, it can't be irreversible because it doesn't involve treaty change, which doesn't come until after the referendum. So I said to him, you're cheating the voters, aren't you? Because if you go to, I call it a pig in the poke, if you go to a meeting or a deal, some deal, and you enter into, you decide you're going to vote on it, on the outcome, but you then discover afterwards that actually what you were sold before didn't have a guarantee with it, so the deal couldn't be regarded as absolute, which it only can be if there's a treaty change. Then people might get quite bothered, actually, if they voted one way and then discovered, oh, none of this happened anyway. Now, I'm not saying that I know that it won't happen. What I am saying is you cannot say it's irreversible. So we can depart that one. It's a legal question, but it's a political question. And then there is this other issue of, so we've got a German issue, we've got a European government issue, we've got a democratic issue, we've got a single market issue. And just touch on the democracy. I'm also, they must love me, I'm doing another inquiry into decision-making in the European Council, which is, or the Council of Ministers, which is quite hair-raising, because actually so much, and we've had Simon Hicks, LSE, very, very interesting evidence from him, and also from, it's all on the website. We don't have secrets in the House of Commons, at least not in terms of legislative behaviour and select committees. I mean, everything's out there, goes out on television. We have meetings with, other members on the floor of the House, and they're all recorded and so on. Not in the European Union, my goodness me, no. You have Coreper, you have an A-list, you have a B-list, and vast majority of things which are said to be uncontentious, as they put it, might be very serious, but they just go through on the norm. But they are discussed by the officials, the unelected officials, and by diplomats in the working group. So the result is there is a huge democratic deficit, which is why there is a -60 distrust factor, according to the latest barometer poll in the European institutions. That's why people are turning against Europe. One chap said to me the other day in the European Commission, he said, the biggest export to the European Union is Euroscepticism, which I thought was quite flattering. But the bottom line is that this is going on, and you don't need to explain it to you, because you can see it for yourselves. And of course, the other thing which I wrote in this book in 1990 was that my judgment about this single market, single currency, which is the euro element, was that whether or not we had an opt-out, it was going to affect us, and that the congregation of power that it would represent for those who were in it, plus the internal contradictions it represented, would inevitably lead towards implosion. And that would, in its own turn, create massive unemployment, protests and riots in the streets, massive unemployment, which is accompanied by waves of immigration from Central and Eastern Europe into the UK, and the rise of the far right. And I said, this is what I don't want, and this is why it's so dangerous. So my argument is not, is it riskier to stay in this? It's actually more dangerous, which I put it rather more firmly in that respect. So that is that side of the equation, but there is also the issue of democracy and the decisions that are taken, as I said, behind these closed doors in unsmoke-filled rooms. Now, if you can't actually know why people have decided things, and we could spend a lot of time on this in my inquiry, so the website has got all the stuff on it, so I don't need to sort of elaborate it, but it really is alarming. And if you were a small businessman and you didn't like the European regulations and you wanted to know how they'd actually gone through on something like vacuum cleaners, it may be of not much importance to some people, but it's a lot of importance to a lot of people. And the result is that if you can't really find out why that deal was struck, and you don't really know what the mechanisms were that led to it, and it might be on this thing, I can never remember, honeybees, you know, Nicky something or others or others. You know, there's some kind of thing that's been pesticides that's killing off bees. You know, look, the technical stuff can be as bad in its own way as some of the macro stuff. And so I just bring you on, as it were, to the last few minutes. Take the ports regulation. I've dealt with the immigration. By the way, just to touch on that once more, actually, the figures are that we're running at the new figures, which the government have agreed, it's going to go up by another 3 million by 2020, 2030. And that means all the families that will come with them as well. I like immigrants, as a matter of fact. I mean, by and large, I've got no sort of problem with it. It's called public services. We're a fairly small country with a limited amount of space, and I actually think that it is causing massive problems, and that's one of the reasons why we've got a housing crisis. But in addition to that, the question of asylum and deportation, and in my committee we've been taking a very, very careful look at this, and it's really becoming a massive problem, because it's the human rights legislation. And I'm actually, anyone who cares to check out my credentials will know that I've got an enormous engagement in matters relating to the Third World, international development. I was chairman of the Jubilee Debt Campaign in 2000. I brought in the Gender Equality European International Development Act, which was my own idea, which I got through the House of Commons. All these things, nobody is going to question my credentials on these matters. But the trouble is, as a human rights lawyer, and actually a lot of it takes place here at King's College, actually, because there's some very preeminent, very intelligent, super lawyers like Francis Jacobs and others. But you see, the thing is, I don't agree with them, because I believe that a lot of the problems that would come, I can argue the case why the human rights needs to be in the European Convention and the Human Rights Act and the Charter of Fundamental Rights, but my judgment is that actually it's been extended, and by court judgments, and Lord Judge has been saying this, and Lord Sumption, Tom Bingham, late Lord Bingham, you can't get bigger than that. And basically the real problem is that it's grown like topsy, and the result is that if you take certain cases, they can cost millions and millions of pounds, and at the same time you can also end up by terrorists being, I would describe them as being given undue and disproportionate advantages, when, you know, I would say it's not appropriate. I won't go into it further than that. But it is causing a crisis. The asylum laws, and look at the Turkey situation now, and look at the return of jihadists to this country, and the question of whether they should be allowed to return, all sorts of questions like this. So the human rights aspect of asylum and immigration are as important as the numbers. So that's another worry. And so I could go on, and I won't, because I think there are questions.
Yes,
How long have I spoken?
Yes, it's fine. We can go on as long as...
No,
we
I
like,
can't.
But, yeah, questions,
but I've said as much as I need to.
Excellent.
Basically, in a nutshell, why I've just been made chairman of the Vote Leave campaign for the whole of the West Midlands and Staffordshire, Warwickshire, etc. And it's going to be quite an interesting exercise. So we'll see how it pans out. All I will say to you is that I said that the trust factor, the instincts, are what I think ultimately, on a reasonably well-informed basis, will have a lot to do with this. And I think my sense of it, I was talking to a very, I won't mention his name, very, very distinguished journalist, one of the top people from the left of the political spectrum, just as I was walking here, and in the House of Commons. And he said, you know something? He said, we're picking up that the people in the Remain camp are getting really worried, because there is a movement, it's the movement of the waters, and it's, I mean, I tell you an example, last weekend there was a civic dinner in my constituency, and all the chain gang were there, that's all the mayors and the deputy mayors and all the things, the whole of Staffordshire, you know, and there was an unbelievable clear message that was coming from all the conversations around the tables, you know? And they did a survey, there's a newspaper called the Express and Star, which is the regional newspaper for Shropshire, Staffordshire, down into Birmingham, all around there. And they had a poll, 8,000 people took part, big poll. Guess what the vote was to leave? 80%. Now, you know, you get the opinion polls across the country at large, and it's not like that. And I'm not going to suggest it's 80, but there's something going on out there, and the wind is blowing. And whether it'll blow everybody off course remains to be seen. But as far as I'm concerned, this is about who governs, the right of people to govern openly, accountability, efficiency, not being pushed around. Forget Mr. Obama. Came over, everybody went bonkers. Opinion polls afterwards, 3 of them, well over 55% said, should never have come, shouldn't have done that, shouldn't have said it. They don't seem to have quite understood, you know? And yesterday, David Cameron was, if you read the Daily Mail today, okay, it's the Daily Mail, but I'd say they've got a finger on the pulse. They have an awful lot of readers. And I tell you this, that Quinton Lett's assessment of the Prime Minister's performance, on which I got my 68,000 hits according to my PA, was, yeah, he's very, very clever, he's very articulate, he's a consummate performer, but don't we deserve better than this? Which is in terms of the argument, that there are serious questions. You can't just turn around to someone like me, and I've given you some idea of where I come from, how I've analysed it, what I think about it. I'm not anti-European. I don't think it's anti-European to be pro-democracy. I love Europe, I love Italy, I love France, I don't have a problem. I just don't think it works.